Hi everyone. Before we dive in, make sure to like, subscribe, and hit that notification bell so you don't miss out on future content. Let's get started. In a quiet suburban neighborhood, a seemingly innocent relationship spiraled into chaos and murder. It all began with a forbidden affair, but the consequences were far beyond anyone's expectations. This is the story of Emma, a devoted Christian wife, and her Muslim neighbor, Ahmed. Their affair, shrouded in secrecy, would lead to a crime that shook the community. It was 2009, and Emma's life appeared to be everything a Christian wife could hope for, living in a modest yet well-kept home in a peaceful neighborhood in Atlanta, Georgia. She was married to Mark, a man respected in their church community for his devout faith. Mark, 38, was a pillar in the church, often leading prayers and involved in every Sunday service. He was disciplined, punctual, and carried a quiet authority. However, their marriage had always been one-sided. To the outside world, Emma and Mark looked like the ideal Christian couple, but within their home, Emma felt a constant emptiness. At 35, Emma was a dedicated housewife, caring for their two children, Sarah and David, aged 12 and 8. She was heavily involved in church activities, Sunday school, charity drives, and women's fellowship, but none of these filled the void inside her. Mark, though a good provider, had grown emotionally distant over the years. They rarely spent time together outside of their church commitments. Emma longed for warmth, affection, and someone who could truly see her beyond the roles of wife and mother. In the quiet of her home, Emma felt invisible. She often sat by the window watching the world pass by, wondering if life would always feel like this. An endless routine of responsibilities, devoid of real connection. The love she once believed would grow with time had stagnated, and Mark seemed more invested in his faith and the family's image than in her needs or feelings. It was during these moments of reflection that Emma first noticed Ahmed, her new neighbor. He had moved into the house next door in the spring of 2009 with his wife, Aisha, and their newborn son. Ahmed, 32, was quiet and polite, always offering a friendly wave when they passed by. A civil engineer, he worked long hours but still found time to attend to his family. His wife, Aisha, stayed home with their baby, rarely seen outside as she struggled with postpartum depression. Emma and Ahmed's interactions began innocently, casual exchanges over the fence, talking about neighborhood issues or their children's schooling. Emma noticed Ahmed's gentle nature, a stark contrast to the cold indifference she often felt from Mark. Over the next few months, the two families began interacting more at neighborhood barbecues and events. Ahmed always showed kindness and respect, and soon, Emma found herself drawn to him in ways she had never anticipated. Emma had never considered straying from her marriage, but she couldn't ignore the growing feelings she had for Ahmed. She tried to suppress them, reminding herself of her vows and the faith she was meant to uphold. Yet, every time she spoke with Ahmed, there was an undeniable connection. He too seemed to be struggling in his marriage. Aisha's depression had created a distance between them, leaving Ahmed lonely and emotionally drained. In many ways, he was experiencing the same isolation Emma felt in her own home. As 2010 approached, Emma and Ahmed's interactions became more frequent. She found herself seeking opportunities to see him, during morning routines or while picking up the mail. Their conversations, though still innocent on the surface, grew deeper. They spoke about their lives, their struggles, and the loneliness they both felt. Ahmed admired Emma's strength in managing her household, while Emma admired Ahmed's calm, thoughtful nature. He listened to her in a way Mark never did. Late at night, Emma often found herself feeling both guilty and excited. She knew what she was doing was wrong, but the sense of being seen and understood by Ahmed was something she hadn't experienced in years. It felt like a light in the darkness of her monotonous life. Ahmed, too, felt conflicted. He had grown up in a conservative Muslim household where marriage was sacred and affairs were strictly forbidden. Yet, the bond he shared with Emma felt different. It was deeper than just attraction. It was as if they understood each other's pain. He would often think of her while away at work, wondering how she was coping with the coldness of her own marriage. Ahmed justified his feelings by telling himself he was providing Emma with the emotional support she lacked. But deep down, he knew they were crossing a dangerous line. By mid-2010, the affair had taken a different turn. What began as emotional support had transformed into something physical. One evening, Ahmed invited Emma over under the pretense of borrowing something for the garden. Aisha was away visiting her family, and the children were asleep. They sat together in Ahmed's living room, the air between them thick with unspoken tension. Neither of them had planned what happened next, but in that moment, they could no longer resist the pull they felt toward one another. That night changed everything. From then on, the two met in secret whenever they could, hiding their affair from their spouses and the rest of the neighborhood. Emma would sneak over to Ahmed's house when Aisha was out, and they would spend hours together. The guilt weighed heavily on both of them, but the forbidden nature of their relationship only intensified the attraction. Emma, a devout Christian, found herself praying for forgiveness each night, only to fall back into Ahmed's arms the next day. She knew what she was doing went against everything she believed in, but she couldn't stop. The thrill, the excitement, the feeling of being wanted, it was intoxicating. Ahmed, on the other hand, began rationalizing his actions. He convinced himself that his marriage to Aisha was already falling apart and that he was giving Emma what she desperately needed, affection and love. But the affair began to take a toll on him as well. He became more distant at home, avoiding conversations with Aisha, who was growing suspicious of his behavior. Ahmed's once calm and collected demeanor began to crack under the weight of the secret. By the end of 2010, both Emma and Ahmed knew they were heading toward disaster. They had crossed a line that could never be uncrossed. Trapped in a web of deceit and passion, they were fully aware that if their spouses found out, the consequences would be devastating. Yet they couldn't stop. Emma, caught between her guilt and her desire for Ahmed, found herself living a double life, pretending to be the perfect wife and mother by day, while indulging in her forbidden affair by night. Ahmed, too, was consumed by his feelings for Emma, unable to break free from the hold she had over him. Their affair had become an addiction, one they both knew would eventually lead to their downfall. On the morning of March 6, 2012, the police received an anonymous tip about a suspicious death at Emma's house. Local authorities arrived to find Mark's body lying in a pool of blood, with Emma in a state of shock. Ahmed was nowhere to be found, having fled the scene immediately after the murder. By late 2011, the weight of the affair had begun to show in both Emma and Ahmed's lives. What once felt like an escape had become an overwhelming burden, making it harder to keep up appearances. Emma, who had always been attentive and active at home, started pulling away from her daily routines. The dinners she once prepared with care now felt like a chore, and she spent less time with her children. Her smiles, once warm and genuine, now seemed forced, hiding something darker beneath. Mark, ever the strict and disciplined man, began to notice these changes. At first, he thought Emma was just tired or overwhelmed with church commitments, but as months passed, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. Mark started noticing her coming home later than usual, claiming she had church meetings or errands to run. Sometimes, she avoided his gaze or gave vague explanations when he asked about her day. His suspicions grew, but instead of confronting her, Mark chose to rely on his faith, believing that prayer and guidance from the church could help resolve any marital issues. Meanwhile, in Ahmed's household, the situation was equally tense. Aisha, sensitive to Ahmed's moods, noticed his behavior becoming more erratic. He was distracted, often leaving the house at odd hours, citing work or errands as his excuse. Still battling postpartum depression, Aisha felt more alone than ever. She tried engaging Ahmed in conversations about their marriage, but he would dismiss her concerns or shift the blame to her, accusing her of not being present enough as a wife or mother. The arguments grew more frequent, and the calm that once defined their household was quickly unraveling. By early 2012, the strain of maintaining their secret relationship was becoming too much for both Emma and Ahmed. Emma's guilt gnawed at her relentlessly, especially on Sunday mornings when she sat in church, listening to sermons about faithfulness, sin, and judgment. Her Christian upbringing had instilled in her a deep fear of eternal damnation, and now she felt like she was living on the edge of it. Every time she looked at her children, she thought about the lies she was telling them. Every time she saw Mark, she feared he would see through her facade. Ahmed, too, was feeling the pressure. His faith had always been important to him, and though he wasn't as devout as Emma in terms of outward religious displays, the teachings of Islam weighed heavily on his conscience. Adultery was not just a sin, it was a betrayal of everything he stood for. Still, every time he thought about ending the affair, the thought of losing Emma seemed unbearable. It was as if they were both trapped in a cycle of desire, guilt, and shame, unable to stop despite the looming consequences. In February 2012, things reached a boiling point. Aisha, tired of Ahmed's evasiveness, confronted him directly about his behavior. She had noticed how distant and emotionally absent he had become, and his lies were starting to unravel. Ahmed denied everything, blaming his work and the stress of the new baby, but Aisha wasn't convinced. The tension in their marriage only grew stronger. Around the same time, Mark's suspicions about Emma became impossible to ignore. He started paying closer attention to her actions, noticing how distracted she seemed, even during the smallest conversations. Emma had become so consumed by the affair that she could no longer maintain the facade that had allowed her to live a double life. Her anxiety skyrocketed, but every time she thought about ending things with Ahmed, she found herself drawn back to him, unable to let go of their connection. The affair reached its breaking point on the night of March 3, 2012. A powerful storm moved through the Atlanta area, bringing heavy rain and strong winds, but the weather was nothing compared to the storm brewing inside Emma's home. Mark had gone on a weekend church retreat, leaving Emma to believe she had the perfect opportunity to meet Ahmed in secret. She had planned the night meticulously, ensuring the children would be at her mother's house and that no one from the neighborhood would suspect a thing. But fate had other plans. Mark, for reasons unknown to Emma, returned early from the retreat. Perhaps his suspicions had grown too strong, or maybe something had unsettled him during his time away. Whatever the reason, he entered their home unannounced, walking in on a scene he could never have imagined. His wife in the arms of another man. Mark's reaction was immediate and fierce. Without thinking, he lunged at Ahmed, grabbing the closest object, a kitchen knife that lay on the counter. The fight that followed was intense, fueled by anger, betrayal, and desperation. Emma, frozen in shock, could only watch as the two men struggled. In the heat of the moment, Ahmed managed to wrestle the knife from Mark, but the momentum of the fight caused it to plunge into Mark's chest twice. The silence that followed was deafening. Emma's scream cut through the stillness as she stood over her husband's lifeless body, her hands trembling. Blood pooled on the floor, mixing with the rainwater that had been tracked in from outside. Ahmed stood there, knife still in hand, breathing heavily as the reality of what had just happened sank in. Neither of them had intended for this to happen, but now there was no turning back. The storm outside continued to rage, but inside the house, the damage was far worse. On the morning of March 6th, the police received an anonymous tip about something suspicious at Emma's house. When they arrived, they were greeted by a gruesome scene. Mark's body lay cold on the floor, blood staining the hardwood beneath him. Emma, still in a state of shock, could barely speak as officers questioned her about what had happened. Ahmed was nowhere to be found, having fled the scene immediately after the murder, leaving Emma to face the aftermath alone. The investigation moved quickly. By March 8th, the police had Emma in for questioning. At first, she tried to protect Ahmed, spinning a story about a break-in gone wrong and claiming that an intruder had murdered Mark. But the detectives weren't convinced. Neighbors had already reported seeing Ahmed at the house more often than could be explained by simple neighborly visits. Moreover, forensic evidence from the scene pointed directly to him. His fingerprints were on the knife, and traces of his clothing were found in the house. Emma's story quickly fell apart, and the police shifted their focus to Ahmed. For days, they searched for him, piecing together his movements after the murder. By March 15th, they had enough evidence to issue an arrest warrant. Ahmed had gone into hiding, finding refuge in a small motel several towns away. His once calm and collected demeanor had shattered under the weight of his actions. On March 20th, Ahmed was found and arrested. He claimed self-defense, insisting that Mark had attacked him first, but the prosecution was determined to prove otherwise. They painted a picture of a man who had let his emotions cloud his judgment, acting out of desperation to cover up an affair that had spiraled out of control. The trial for Mark's murder began on May 15, 2013, and it drew intense attention from the entire Atlanta community, especially those from Emma and Mark's church. The once highly regarded Christian couple, now exposed in a scandalous affair that ended in bloodshed, became the subject of whispers and shocked glances in every corner of the town. From the start, the courtroom was filled with palpable tension. Emma, once known for her quiet devotion, now sat accused of a crime that shattered the very values she had long upheld. She had always been seen as the dutiful wife, but now she was publicly exposed as an adulterer. The shame weighed heavily on her as she faced the jury, knowing that every detail of her affair with Ahmed would be revealed. Emma's fragile emotional state was evident in her pale complexion, her hands trembling as she sat in silence. Ahmed, too, was a shell of the man he once was. Gone was the calm, composed neighbor who had quietly built a life for himself and his family. Instead, he appeared gaunt, his once sharp features dulled by months of guilt and sleepless nights. He knew there was no escape from the truth: the affair, the murder, and the devastation it had caused. His life, once structured and respectable, was now a complete mess. The prosecution wasted no time in laying out their case. They meticulously pieced together the events of March 3, 2012, painting a vivid picture of two lovers whose passion and desperation had spiraled into violence. What had begun as a means of emotional escape had transformed into a dangerous game, one that ended with a man dead and two families destroyed. The courtroom was captivated as the prosecution revealed the full extent of the affair. Emma, after enduring relentless cross-examination, eventually broke down, confessing to the relationship with Ahmed. Her attempts to cover for him had crumbled, and with each passing day of the trial, the weight of her guilt became more visible. The admission of the affair shocked those who had known Emma for years. How could the woman they had admired for her faith and commitment to her family betray everything they believed she stood for? Ahmed's defense, meanwhile, was weak. He maintained that the murder had been an accident, an act of self-defense when Mark attacked him in a fit of rage. However, the prosecution countered with forensic evidence and witness testimonies that suggested otherwise. Neighbors had seen Ahmed visiting Emma's house too frequently, their secret meetings no longer as well concealed as they had believed. The prosecution argued that Ahmed had every reason to cover up the affair and that he was willing to do whatever it took to protect their secret, even if it meant killing Mark in the heat of the moment. By the time the closing arguments were made in early July, the outcome of the trial seemed inevitable. On July 20, 2013, Ahmed was sentenced to 25 years in prison for manslaughter. The verdict came as a relief to some, but others felt that justice had only been partially served. Many believed Ahmed deserved a harsher punishment, that the full extent of his betrayal and the murder warranted more than just 25 years. The fallout from the trial sent shockwaves through the tight-knit Atlanta community, forever altering the lives of everyone involved. Emma's sentence, reduced due to her cooperation with authorities, still left her facing 15 years in prison, a punishment that weighed heavily as she came to terms with the reality of being separated from her children for more than a decade. The sentence reflected her remorse but did little to ease the devastation felt by her family and the broader community. The local church, once a symbol of unity and faith, was torn apart by the scandal. Mark, a respected member, and Emma, once admired for her devotion, had left a void that no one could fill. Church members, who had once worked and worshipped alongside the couple, were left questioning how such darkness could have been hidden beneath the surface of their seemingly perfect lives. The whispers of judgment were harsh, with Emma's name becoming synonymous with betrayal and deceit. Even in a place meant to offer solace, forgiveness seemed hard to come by. Emma's children, Sarah and David, were perhaps the most affected. At 14, Sarah was old enough to understand what had happened, but she couldn't process how her family had disintegrated so quickly. The mother she once saw as a role model now felt like a stranger, and the sense of betrayal ran deep, though she couldn't find the words to express it. David, still just 10, didn't fully grasp the magnitude of the tragedy. He only knew that his father was gone and his mother wasn't coming home. The children were sent to live with relatives, leaving behind not only their parents but the life for Aisha. The emotional devastation was profound. Betrayed by both her husband and a woman she once considered a friend, she packed her belongings and left the neighborhood soon after the trial ended. Taking her young child with her, Aisha left behind the memories of her shattered marriage, knowing she could never return to the life she had built with Ahmed. The weight of his betrayal ran too deep, and she knew she had to rebuild far from the wreckage he had left in his wake. Ahmed, from his prison cell, was left with nothing but time to reflect on the choices that had led him there. Guilt consumed him, knowing that his actions had not only taken Mark's life but also destroyed his own family. His child would grow up without a father, and Aisha's forgiveness would never come. The career and future he had once envisioned were gone, replaced by years of solitude and regret. The affair that once seemed like an escape had instead become the undoing of everything he held dear. The neighborhood, once peaceful and filled with close-knit families, was left to grapple with the tragedy. The shock lingered for years, with residents whispering about the affair and the murder whenever they passed by Emma's old house. A place that once symbolized suburban bliss had become a haunting reminder of what had transpired within its walls. The scandal left an indelible mark on the community, a reminder of how lives can quickly unravel when secrets fester and passions are left unchecked. The story of Emma and Ahmed is a cautionary tale about the devastating consequences of forbidden love, guilt, and desperation. Their choices didn't just destroy their own lives. They tore apart the very fabric of a neighborhood that had once believed in the purity of faith and family. If you found this story compelling, you might also be interested in the case of a housewife whose affair with a priest shocked an entire community. Don't forget to like and subscribe for more incredible crime stories.